Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope you all had a good and meaningful Rosh Hashanah, and I wish you a Shana Tova. It's great to begin our new year learning together. I wanted to look at the final sub-sugya, which is Haiman Ovid Chalta, Chayv Achatosrei Chatos. Once again, this sugya is a little bit of a tour around the whole of Masechet Shabbat, because it goes through so many different melachos. Nonetheless, I think there's a number of very, very interesting points to make, and some of them will be chazara on things that we've previously discussed. So, Haiman Ovid Chalta, someone makes a some sort of utensil which is formed by weaving together reeds. Is chayav achatosrei chatos, 11 chatos. The ichayte de pume. And if they sew the mouth, then they're chayav shloshesrei chatos, they're chayav 13 chatos. That's the sugya. So I just really want to run through Rashi's list of the melachos and say a few ha'aras. Again, it's a little bit sort of bits and pieces like we've had with the previous sub-sugyas here, but I think there's a few interesting ha'aras, and then in Mitzvah Hashem after Sukkot we'll start the next sugya, which is back to being a sugya that focuses on one particular melacha. So Rashi says kotza, harvesting the reeds. The next melacha that Rashi says is a little difficult. The next melacha Rashi says is notea. Now, how do you do notea in this melacha? So the answer is through zemira, through harvesting, you end up pruning the reeds, and therefore you're chayav because of notea, because that encourages, it spurs the growth of the reeds. Now, I think there's two questions on Rashi. Question number one is that this melacha therefore turns out not to be integral to the reeds utensil making process. It's a side melacha. It happens to be that when you harvest the reeds, you also cause the growth, you also prune them and cause them to grow further, and therefore it happens to be chotza. Nonetheless, this is not integral to the process, and it would seem that Rashi is not bothered by that, since Lamaisa, you are doing this melacha by, in the production process, that's enough to list it amongst the melachas that you're chayav for. So that's one question. The more profound question is that l'chora, it's perfectly feasible to do the melacha, to make this reed basket, even without doing the melacha of notea. And this is because of what we saw in Rashi in Ein Gimel Amud Beis, in which Rashi seemed to say that you have to be neskavein latzmiach. You have to have kavanah to cause growth. In other words, when you're kotza, when you harvest, are you only chayav for harvesting, or are you also chayav for zemira? And the answer is, Rashi seems to say that you're only chayav for pruning, which is a tolda of notea, by encouraging growth, if you intend to do so in order to encourage the growth. So how can this be listed as one of the 11 melachos integral to the process of basket making, when it's subject to whether you intend to encourage growth by so doing? And I think the answer to the question is what we saw also in Rashi on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, in which Rashi spoke about these grasses, where the very production process is that you harvest and prune and harvest and prune, and you get this cycle going in which it causes growth, and then you harvest the next crop and the next crop and the next crop. And we were medayik there in Rashi that there you don't need kavanah, because then this is the very hard. We asked the stew in Rashi, why don't you need kavanah there? And the answer was, this is integral to the harvesting process. With grasses, this is the way it works. You harvest the grass, and then the next batch grows, and the next batch grows. And it would appear that this is pshat in Rashi, that with these reeds, even without kavanah, this is integral to the process, and therefore you're chayav even without the kavanah to be zomer. So this is in the next point in Rashi. The next melacha that Rashi lists is ma'ameh, which is gathering things in. Now, we discussed a lot about Meleches Ma'ameh when we learned it, again on Ein Gimel on Beis. We saw it only applies to agricultural products. It's a melacha in the field. It only applies to things that are b'mokum geduloi, not just geduloi dekaka, but only in the place that they grew. It wouldn't apply to things which are produced in a factory, which are there. We discussed it in the context of the salt, which is harvested from the salt beds and so on. But either way, here is a raya, the Minchas Chinuch brings a raya from here, that there's imur even with things which aren't food. It's not integral. It's integral to the imur process, that it's gedurei karka, but it's not integral to the imur karka. It's not integral to the ma'ameh process, that it has to be foods. So again, this is just one of the rayos that's brought from this Gemara. The next melacha that Rashi lists is boreh, and again, this is chazara on some of the sugyas we learned. With boreh, there was a whole discussion as to how different the products have to be. And the general rule, which is brought in Shulchan Aruch, is that with one min and one type of food, it's a Trumas Hadeshen really, but it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, that with one type of food, there's no boreh. If you are boreh, the slightly better food from the slightly worse food, it isn't enough to do meleches boreh. So over here, Rashi, when he says that when you're boreh the good ones from the bad ones, why is it meleches boreh? And the answer would appear to be that since the low-quality konim are not suitable for making baskets at all, they therefore count as a separate species, effectively. In other words, this would be like extracting rotten food, and if you have moldy food and good food, and you separate the two, that would be the melacha of boreh. And therefore, even with one min, this is called, if it was an edible, that would be enough to make it the melacha of boreh. And therefore, since it's not suitable for basket making, with respect to basket making, this is enough for the melacha of boreh. Now, Rashi says that you are bira hayofas, you choose the good ones. Now, l'chora, since you're going to use them straight away, this is being boreh yofas, so you're taking the oichel metoich b'soiles, and it's for miyad, it's for immediate use, and it's b'yad, it's using your hands. Now, the answer, which we saw again on Ayin Daled Amud Aleph in the Sugya of boreh, that wouldn't be included in boreh if you're doing it immediately. And the answer to this question would again appear to be that the whole svara of miyad is when it's oichel. When you're eating it and therefore consuming it, it's not manufacturing or production, it's achila. However, where you're producing a keli, it's not enough to say that it's miyad, because by definition you're producing a keli for long-term use, and therefore this is manufacturing rather than it falling within the exemption of derech achila. So even though derech achila could even be non-achila things, it couldn't include manufacturing, which by definition is long-term.
Is it long-term, Rabbizobin, because there are more processes to go in the process? No,
it's is long-term.
But why wouldn't it just be long-term anyway? Because you haven't finished the process. You've got another 6 stages to go.
But you're using it immediately for that stage, and therefore that shouldn't be enough.
But we say if you select a book or whatever, that's for, you're selecting a book for immediate use. That's not food. I mean, that's for immediate use, but it's for long-term use.
No, that's exactly the point. You can select a book for immediate use because your use is reading it, and that's the consumption of the book, whereas manufacturing, by definition, is long-term. Okay, so that would appear to be the answer of boreh. Having said that, this answer is a touch disingenuous. It's a good answer, it's a great answer, but it doesn't work in Shittas Rashi, because Rashi's view is, if you remember Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, that even without the condition of la'alta, if you do it b'yad and oichel metoich b'soiles, you are potter even without the condition of immediate use. So why would Rashi say that immediate use? Why would Rashi here say it's boreh? And the answer would have to be that Rashi understood that b'yad isn't a get out of jail free card. It's with something where the normal way of doing boreh is with a keli, then doing it b'yad is not derech boreh. But with something where the normal way of doing it is b'yad, then b'yad would still leave you would still leave you as chayiv. So in brief, there's 2 points to make over here with boreh. Number one, even though you're using it immediately to make the keli, it's not called miyad. La'alta, it's not called immediate use, because by definition making a utensil is manufacturing, is long-term use, which is what a melacha is, as opposed to consumption, derech achila. And number one. And number two, according to Rashi, you'd have to say, since the normal way to do it is biyad, that would be enough to make you chayev, even when you're doing it biyad. So this is the melacha of boreh. The next Melacha Rashi lists is Mamachik, which I'm not going to speak about for now. If we've got time, I may come back to it when we discuss the Rabbeinu Chananel. And then the next Melacha is Teichen. Now, this is a sugya which ends up very, very important to Halacha L'maisa. When we learned the Melacha of Teichen, it was very unclear how small you have to grind something down to make you chayiv the Melacha of Teichen. This remains unclear in the poskim, and as a result, we're not just makbid on Teichen when you make a flour, like a powder like Tzechina. We saw earlier in the Omud, in Daled Omud Aleph, Haimam Deporim Frima, and other examples that even if you cut things duck, if you chop things duck, that's already enough to say you're chayiv. And the definition of duck is a little unclear. If you make a TCP salad where you cut tomatoes and cucumbers into small pieces, in practical halacha, we are choshesh for this being toichen, even though the pieces are not that small. Now, what's the limit to this? At what point are we safe? So there is a teshuvah of Rav Moshe Feinstein around this topic, and also a teshuvah of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in which they quote our sugya. I will post on the WhatsApp group as soon as she finishes a PDF with a copy of this teshuvah of Rav Moshe Feinstein, teshuvah of this copy of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. But Rav Moshe Feinstein argues that it's obvious that if you slice cucumbers, for example, if you take a cucumber and you slice it lengthways or widthways to make thin slices, you make either thin sort of cucumber sticks or slices, he says this will not be toichen. Toichen has to be both width and lengthways. He says otherwise, ein of a safe, you would have to worry about toichen even when you cut or slice a piece of bread, or you cut up an apple, etc. I mean, with slicing piece of bread, there's other issues of ein tchina acha tchina. But he says there'd be no gavul to this. So if you slice and create a slice rather than a piece, Rav Moshe argues that this would be mutter. This is Rav Moshe in Orach Chaim Chelik Daled, Siman Ein Daled. He has lots of sections there. It's a very long teshuvah, and he deals with many of the melachas. But amongst the melachas he deals with there is Teichen, and I'll post the exact source on the WhatsApp group later. Now, Rav Moshe argues that that's obvious that you will not be chayav Teichen for that. So now he has a kasha from our Gemara. Because in our Gemara, you see that if you slice reeds down the length of the reeds to make long, thin sticks of reeds, that would be enough to make you chayiv for toichen, even though it doesn't make a piece. It's just lengthways, not widthways. And he says this is only with these sorts of things, with reeds, where all toichen is a difficult malacha. Because how does it make it a different? What's the asiyah, what's the outcome, the production, the totzah, the new functionality created through toichen? After all, it remains in substance the same thing, simply cut into smaller pieces. When you bake a bread, it changes from being raw dough to bread or cake. When you cook food, it changes from being a hard raw potato to a nice soft potato. When you do toichen, what am I changing in the substance of the object? And the answer, as we saw when we learned toichen, is that there's a new functionality that comes in through it being a small piece. Rav Moshe argues that with foods, the new functionality is it's something new has to happen. If it's chopped width and lengthways and you have a salad, you have smaller pieces, that's the melacha. If you just cut it into slices, this isn't a new functionality. With the reeds, says Rav Moshe, this is a new functionality because you can't use a reed to construct a reed basket unless you slice it into thin strips. So with reeds, it makes sense to say it's a melacha when you slice it into thin strips. However, with other foods, Rav Moshe argues that it doesn't make sense to call it a melacha just by slicing it into strips without making it into small pieces. So in brief, the definition of duck, small pieces, remains unclear in halacha, but at least Rav Moshe sets a standard, which is if it's just a slice, then this isn't the melacha of toichen. So that's just a ha'ara on toichen, and I'll place that on the group. Now, Rashi brings a second pshat in the sugya, which is kadeach nekovim, if you drill the holes. So I don't know exactly how reed making works. I once went out in the countryside. We saw one of these crafts fairs where there were people making reed baskets, and I watched with great interest because of this sugya over here. But it would appear that you make a hole in the reed, and then you thread the reed through the hole in order to attach this reed basket. And Rashi says, very interesting, that you're chayav for toichen because it creates a dust. Rashi brings that there are those who say you're chayiv for toichen because it creates a powder, a dust, through the drilling process, and therefore you're chayiv. On that, Rashi says, no, I disagree, because he says that techina is melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. A reminder, melacha she'ein tzricha legufa means a melacha where you are not doing it for the primary purpose of the melacha. You're doing the same melacha, but not for the positive or primary purpose of the melacha. A classic couple of examples that we gave several times. One is seder. If you capture an animal because you want to use the animal to eat or for its skin, then that would be seder. If you capture the animal because you don't want it, you want to keep it out of the way, like a bee, to stop it stinging you or so on, that would be melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. Another example is when you take an object out of your house onto the street because you want it in the street. It's melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. If it's rubbish and you just don't want it in your house, then that's melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. And we saw that's a machlokas tanoim whether you're chayiv or not. Rashi paskins that a normal, because Rashi holds this as halacha, he holds that a stam Gemara follows the view that melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is potter. He considers that the mainstream opinion, and therefore Rashi says you will not be chayiv for the powder that is created. Now, the Rambam paskins that melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is chayiv, and we discussed this previously. And when we learned the sugya of toichen, we saw a view of the Rambam that in Perik Ches Halacha Tesvav, you will remember, the Rambam says that if you saw something and that creates sawdust, you're only chayiv if you need the sawdust. You need the sawdust for some sort of product. Or similarly, he spoke about if you trim metal and it creates metal powder, you're only chayiv for the melacha toichen if you need that powder. Which means to say that the Rambam understands that even if the Rambam paskins that melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is chayiv, nonetheless, when it comes to toichen, you are potter, even though melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is chayiv, you're only chayiv if you need the sawdust. So, just to summarize what I've said so far, the Rashi says that the only downside, the only lack when you create sawdust is you're doing the melacha, you're creating sawdust. It's just not a melacha she'ein tzricha legufa because it's a side need. And the Rambam says, no, the essence of the melacha only makes sense when you need the sawdust. So why should it be that it's only when you need the sawdust that you're chayiv, even if you hold the melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is chayiv? So at the time when we learned toichen, we discussed several reasons for this, and I'll just remind you of some of them. One possible answer is mekalkel. Grinding something down to a sawdust is destructive unless you need the sawdust. If you remember again the structure of the Gemara in Ayin Gimel and Beis, the Gemara said besides the issue of melacha she'ein tzricha legufa, there's also the issue of kilkul. This is a little bit of a chazara. There's also the issue of a melacha which is negative and destructive, which you're potter from. So you may have a reason for doing a destructive melacha. However, if it's fundamentally mekalkel, it's not the melacha. Melacha is a creative act, not a destructive act. So I may have a chair which I wish to dismantle because it's easier to fit it into the wheelie bin like that. There is a reason why I'm destroying it, but I'm reducing the net utility in the world, the net functionality in the world. I'm destroying the keli and therefore that's mekalkel and I'm potter. Similarly, if I erase a check, or a private note, which I don't want people to see, there's a reason I'm doing it. I don't want people to see it, but I'm destroying writing. That's mekalkel, that's not a melacha. So the Rambam may learn that creating sawdust, if I don't need it, is always a mekalkel. Now it's true that there's something positive in what I'm doing from the perspective of the keli. If I am boring a hole in an implement, I'm doing something positive from the point of view of the implement. However, from the point of view of the sawdust, I'm doing something negative. The bit of wood which is chipped away from it is something negative. So if you remember, in every melacha, we need to look at, are there two objects that I'm working on or one object that I'm working on? So for example, with zoymer v'tzorech le'etzim, where I'm pruning and I need the wood, the melacha of getting the wood, the kaitza, is a melacha in the branch. The zoymer, the pruning, is a melacha in the tree. So the melacha is being done. It's not two melachas which are taking place coincidentally in the same on the same object. It's actually melachas taking place on different objects. The zoymer, the pruning, is a melacha in the tree, and the kaitza is a melacha in the branch. There could be other cases where I'm doing two melachas in one object. Now let's analyze over here. When I'm boring my hole in this woven wickerwork basket, am I doing the melacha that is two melachas in one object or two objects? The answer is two objects. I'm creating the useful hole in the weed, which is something positive, and I'm also destroying the little bit of wood which is coming off as sawdust, which is being destroyed, which is a kilkul. So the Rambam would argue that even if you hold that a melachot shein tzricha l'gufa is chayev, in other words, sawdust created when I don't need sawdust could be a melacha, nonetheless, since from the point of view of the sawdust, that little bit of wood which has now become a dust, it's a kilkul. The Rambam would argue that this is not a melacha, this is a kilkul, a destructive act, and therefore not a melacha. Rashi would disagree. Rashi would say, since I'm doing something positive in the creation of the basket, I would be chayev, and this shouldn't be viewed as kilkul, other than the issue of melacha shein tzricha l'gufa. So this again is a very, very important maramokum in the sugyas of the different understanding of the Rishonim. This is one suggestion as to why the Rambam considers it not a melacha unless I need the sawdust. There's many other suggestions. The second suggestion is that the Rambam considers sawdust to be so insignificant it's not a melacha unless it's needed. It's a bit like if you walk in the street on Shabbos and there's a fleck of dust on your suit jacket. This isn't chatzi shear. You're not carrying less than a shear. You're not chayiv because it's less than a shear, but maybe it's chatzi shear, which we discussed. Is also we discussed when we learned chatzi shear on Ayin Daled Omid Aleph. Whether it's Osam in Torah, Osam in Rabbanon, whatever it may be, you're not allowed to do a chatzi shear. You can't go out on Shabbos with a small biscuit. However, a fleck of dust is insignificant. It's even if you're aware of it, it's got no chashivas whatsoever. So it could be the Rambam understands that creating sawdust has no chashivas, no significance whatsoever, unless you need the malacha. Otherwise, it's a malacha in dust. Dust is nothing, and that's the reason why the Rambam would say you are potters. There's a number of theories put forward about this unique and original view of the Rambam that creating toichen, that there's a unique element to the malacha of toichen, which powdering when you don't need the powder is always exempt. As Rashi, you see clearly Rashi doesn't agree with that line of thought, and Rashi thinks you are chayev for powdering even when you don't need the powder. So this is the malacha of toichen. Rashi lists mechateich. I'm not going to go into that malacha. Mechateich is trimming, cutting. It's only the malacha of cutting when you are doing it to a specific size. If you're korea, if you tear because you want to reattach something or something like that, that's malacha of korea. Mechateich is where you're cutting to size in a very precise manner. Then Rashi lists mesich and base boti nirin, which again I'm not going to go into. These are weaving malachas, and setting up of the weaving, orig, which is weaving the branches, and makib patish, which we discussed previously. Rashi then also adds in the scenario of chait lepume, where you attach the sew together, the mouth. Rashi says that there's the malacha of toifer, of sewing over here, and this is used lahalacha by the biur halacha on Shulchan Aruch to prove that the malacha of sewing doesn't only apply to fabrics but also applies to solids. So the biur halacha says that you see from this, if you glue together two solid objects, this is also included in the malacha of toifer. Or from our sug, you see if you stitch together two such solid objects, it's also the malacha of toifer, not just stitching fabrics, but stitching solid objects is also included in the malacha and attaching them in that manner. And obviously this has important ramifications in practical halacha. And so again, just an important maramokum. So this is Shittas Rashi on the sugya. I just want to carry on in the 4 remaining minutes that I've left to quickly say a couple of oros on Rabbi Hananel's view on the sugya, and with that we will conclude the sugya. But I will post, as I said, some of the maramakomis on the sugya just to give you some learning to do over Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Very fascinating shivas of Rabbi Zobin and Ramosha. Now I'm not going to go through the full list of the Rabbi Hananel's view over here. Other than to say that Rabbi Hananel changes from Rashi to the best of my knowledge in 2 places, as far as I could tell. The first is that instead of saying the machik, which is smoothing, which Rashi said is smoothing, the Rabbi Hananel says there's dosh. Now this is a very fascinating sugya. We did learn the malacha of dosh together. I think we did with dosh, didn't we? We did do dosh. Dosh is threshing, when you crack a grain out of its sort of envelope of corn, in which it sounds, yes, this was one of the first malachas that we did at the bottom of Ein Gimel on the base when we learned the malachas of Dosh. Listen to the recordings if you want to do chazara on Dosh. Now, Rabbeinu Chanana learns that dosh is applicable over here when you skin the cane. Now, I don't want to go into the sugya fully, but at the time that we learned the sugya, we saw a view of a Magen Avraham who discusses whether peeling onion skin off an onion is the melacha of, this is the Magen Avraham in Siman Shin Yod Ches, Siv Cotton Ches, I think. The Magen Avraham discusses whether when you peel skin off an onion, is the melacha to think about the melacha of boira, or the melacha to think about is the melacha of dosh. And the Magen Avraham, and the nafkamina, by the way, is whether the heta of la'alta, of immediate use, would help. Dosh is an agricultural melacha, and la'alta, immediate use, wouldn't help. Boira is a kitchen melacha, and therefore immediate use does help. It's not intrinsically a manufacturing melacha, as we saw in Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. Now, the Magen Avraham establishes as a principle that peeling a layer off something is the melacha of boira, not the melacha of dosh. He says a grain which is enveloped in a shell, that's the melacha of dosh. Peeling is not dosh. Peeling is peeling a peel of something. You'd have to think about boira, but you wouldn't have to think about the melacha of dosh. The Rabbeinu Chananel here evidently argues and seems to say that even peeling could be the melachot of dosh. And then just to remind you, dosh is extracting a food from its shell, its case. A tolda of dosh is squeezing juice. It's creating a new object which is in a casing. Is a peel the same as a casing, or is a peel simply attachment between one thing and another thing? This is the shiloh over here. When you have a grain in the casing of the stalk, it's not a peel, it's sitting in a casing, and this is the machlokas where the peeling is included in the melacha. The Rabbeinu Chananel evidently learns yes, but this is not clear cut. And as I said, there's a very important halacha namaisa distinction about whether the het of miyad would help. Is the melacha boya, or is the halacha is the halacha dosh? The second difference is in the Rabbeinu Chananel is that he lists oreg, and sorry, Rashi says oreg, and Rabbeinu Chananel says boina. I don't really have a clarity as to what would make you choose each melacha. I mean, Rashi can't say boina because Rashi holds ein binyan b'kelim. Rashi implies that were there to be binyan b'kelim, which we discussed in the previous year, then the melacha relevant would be both oreg and boina. The Ritva on the sugya, the Rabbeinu Chananel says it's boina, not oreg. So he evidently holds yesh binyan b'kelim, and I don't know why he doesn't say it's oreg. And the Ritva says that the reason it's oreg, not boina, isn't because ein binyan b'kelim, you do have binyan b'kelim, but because as soon as it's oreg, by definition, it can't be boina. In other words, when we look at what's going on over here, I'm combining parts to make a utensil. Let's just step back and understand this. I'm combining parts to make a utensil. So we have two questions to ask ourselves. Question number one is combination of parts to make something. Is this only with a building? That's Rashi's view, but not with a utensil. Or is it even with utensils, which is the view of other Rishonim, as we discussed in the last year? Rashi says it's only with utensils. There's no binyan. To talk about the melacha is oreg. The Ritva holds there is binyan with kalim. So we could talk about the melacha of binyan over here. However, the Ritva says you're combining in a unique manner. You're not doing any old combination. You're weaving things together. That's not boiner. That's oreg. That is the melacha of weaving. The melacha of weaving is a unique type of merging different things together, and therefore the melacha is the melacha of oreg, not the melacha of boiner. It reminds us a little bit of the previous discussion we had about whether things can be two melachas when you're doing the identical thing twice. We saw with makeh b'patish. If it's another melacha, then maybe by definition it's not makeh b'patish. It's sort of somewhat analogous over here. The Ritva argues it can't be boiner because it is the melacha of it's the melacha of oreg, not the melacha of boiner. So we've run out of time. I think that brings us to the end of the this sugya, which is a bit of a tour of many melachos. Mitzvah Hashem after Sukkot will resume with learning more in particular and individual melachos rather than whizzing through many melachos. And I wish everyone a meaningful and positive and healthy and good Yom Kippur. Thank you again so much for being part of the show. Looking forward to seeing you after Yom Tov.